Hello Internet, says Skorikowski. Today we're going to talk about dungeons. I've mentioned over the years how I've run and written countless dungeons, and I've regularly been asked about my philosophies and my approach and how I go about designing them. The problem is that it's never been anything that I've really thought about in an organized way. It was just simply something that I did, something that evolved without really any conscious steps to it. So I pondered this question, I started articulating and organizing my thoughts, and I looked over several videos and blogs to see how other gamers had honed it down to an established method and had organized themselves. But what I quickly realized is that while most of them have some really cool ideas and very sound advice, some of it I'd never considered before, I don't really agree 100% with any of them. The main reason is that I can name some wonderful exceptions to just about every single rule that they offer, which, exceptions are totally fine. There's always going to be exceptions. There's going to be exceptions to what I'm going to talk about today. But there were just so many of them, and there were so many aspects that those other GMs had never covered that I felt their advice had become just a little bit too limiting, sort of generic advice on making generic dungeons. Now, this video is going to be system neutral, meaning that I'm going to use the same approach whether it's D&D or Call of Cthulhu, Traveler, or whatever, but a lot of this is going to be geared towards classic fantasy games, mostly because I learned how to do dungeons by playing, AD&D. And as a quick note, I did the official rewrite for the classic Traveler adventure Death Station, which if you want an example of a dungeon in space, that is totally free on DriveThruRPG, link below. Now when I say dungeon layout, what that means is that dungeon is a self-contained environment where the adventure is set. Walls, floor, most likely a ceiling, but not guaranteed. Now this could be a cave, a skyscraper, nuclear bunker, catacomb, sewers, subway tunnel, derelict spaceship, or whatever else. The same general advice is going to apply, just simply, change it up to meet whatever the situation is. Now why the characters are entering this dungeon is completely up to you. They're going to need a reason to go inside, a potential payoff in order to do it. Now maybe it's to find fame and treasure, maybe it's to escape, maybe they're merely using it to pass through, like the Mines of Moria, and that is the adventure's plot, and the plot is entirely up to the game master. The dungeon is the setting for the plot, and while it may house many threats and monsters, the dungeon itself should be a nemesis. It should have a personality, and it should be memorable, and it should feel like a real place to your players. So that's what we're going to cover today. Now, while I did try to organize and compress all this down, there was just so much information, like a shotgun blast worth of ideas and suggestions, that I'm going to be splitting this up into two videos. This video is going to cover the physical structure, incorporating its history, populating it, the environmental needs, the style, and other aspects like that. Now, traps, rewards, and plot objectives I'm going to be covering in another video, and that one's going to be specifically covering traps, tricks, threats, obstacles, puzzles, which are all closely related but different things that we often just refer to under the term traps, as well as different types of dungeon adventure plot styles, and I'm already working on that video. I'm actually finishing up the script right now, so I should have that out in the next week or two, but a bit of those topics is going to be touched on in this video because, everything is interconnected, but the deep dive into those topics is going to be given there. But for now, let's talk about the dungeons themselves. Now, I don't have an order of operations about making a dungeon. Much of this is going to be simultaneous, or I might begin with one or two kind of cool ideas, like a specific trap or a specific feature, and then I just kind of build it out from there. So don't think of this as a step one, step two, but more like a lot of things to consider, and you can consider them in any order that you like and do some back and forth, and by no means does all of this need consideration for every single dungeon that you make. Kind of choose which ones you want to consider depending on whatever dungeon it is. Now, first up is the type of dungeon. Not all dungeons are the same. There's the construction type to consider. We have natural constructions such as limestone caves, lava tubes, ice caves, buckling earth, or grown out of crystal. These have no designer or builder. It's a crazy labyrinth of uneven floors, tiny fissures opening up into vast chambers, stalactites dripping from the ceiling. There are a few, if any, straight lines that are going to be found in this place. Then we have unnatural construction. These dungeons have been built. They could be mines, subterranean strongholds, actual dungeons, nuclear bunkers, giant ant mounds, buildings that were buried beneath ice or lava. Something or someone built these with a purpose. And of course, we can have different combinations of these, such as a large cave, but inside of it is a pyramid that's been built, sort of like Alien versus Predator. Then there's the residents. What, if anything, is populating this dungeon? I usually categorize these into living dungeons, meaning that there is something that is alive inside of it. This population might be wild, meaning that it's populated with animals or non-intelligent monsters, even monstrous plants. Or civilized, meaning that the occupants are intelligent. There is a society which may be primitive or it might be advanced. Even an orc society is civilized by their own standards. They might construct mechanical or magical traps or doors or make physical changes to the layout of this dungeon. Similar are non-living dungeons, which are populated with constructs, robots, or undead. Maybe even intelligent and organized undead, but they're still going to be undead robots. They don't need food or air or water or many of the things that living creatures require. Then there's unpopulated dungeons or dead dungeons. These have no combat. The dungeon itself provides all the obstacles. Our characters may even be the first living things to ever set foot inside this place, or maybe the first living things to set foot in here in a very long time, though they still need to contend with the natural hazards and whatever safeguards that this dungeon's builders had put into place. Once again, we can do different combinations of these, such as the large dungeon. We might have sections that are living, non-living, and sections that are just completely unpopulated. But these are all things to consider when you're creating your dungeon, because what obstacles and features and rewards should be influenced by and reflect what type of dungeon it is, not just giving it a flavor, but a logic to the whole thing. I'm very big on the logic within the framework of the game world. It really increases the player immersion, and also once I know what it is that we're dealing with, unnatural construction and intelligent creatures, it really helps me focus on how I go about making the rest of it. Next, if the dungeon is populated, what's it populated with? Now, one problem that a lot of early D&D adventures had, and a mistake that a lot of dungeon masters make, is what's referred to as the monster mash, or in Call of Cthulhu, it's called the Mythos Hoedown. And that's when a game master is throwing a ton of random monsters in a dungeon together with no real logic behind it. It's like every room is a totally different monster in it. Like they just kind of opened up the monster book and just kind of went through going like, I want one of those, and one of those, and one of those. Now that might work for funhouse dungeons. Funhouses are kind of the exception to just about everything that I'm going to say here. Notable ones include White Plume Mountain, where we had a designer who intentionally arranged a bunch of crazy and random things for our heroes to face. Either it was done as a test, or maybe just for their own twisted amusement. Then if that's it, then in the game world logic, that still works. But most dungeons are not going to be the funhouse style, and if it's not, we need to use the logic as to why all these monsters are here in one place and how these creatures all interact with one another. I love a lot of diversity in my dungeons. Dungeons with only one thing in it, that can become pretty monotonous pretty quickly. But we also need to have some sort of logic as to why all these creatures are here and kind of how that works between them. Maybe we have a large monster that lives here, some population like a horde of goblins, but there's also other monsters here, and they're feeding off of their leftover food or their excrement. Maybe they're at the bottom of the latrine and we have some sort of creature like a gelatinous cube or whatever that weird thing in Star Wars was that was living in the garbage compactor. Maybe they're parasitic pests that are feeding off the population, or maybe symbiotic, kind of like those birds that clean the teeth of crocodiles. Or maybe they're intentionally here as pets or to cut down on rodents, like that spider that keeps frogs in its lair to help get rid of those small bugs that could eat her eggs. Now imagine a giant version of these. Consider the ecology of the residents. What is it that they eat? Where do they get their water? Are the dungeon exits big enough to allow this creature to get out and, hunt for food or just accommodate them in general? Some of the monsters are going to need a lot of food to survive, so they're going to need to have a food source available to them. So if you have a dungeon and one cavern chamber has this big scary monster in it, what's stopping that monster from just kind of going down the hall and eating every other thing that's living in this dungeon, Or what's stopping all the organized residents that are living on the other half of this dungeon from, all rising up and getting rid of that big scary monster down the hall that's been trying to eat them? Now, maybe the residents on one side of the dungeon have sealed off access to the other side, or they've posted guards to keep those monsters at bay or give them some sort of warning if that monster is on the way. And the players, as they're exploring the dungeon, they might have to contend with these barriers, and maybe their action of, removing those barriers or taking out those guards, that's going to cause the threat living on the other side of the dungeon to come over and invade this side. Barriers and fortification between dungeon sections, that really gives some great foreshadowing of some yet-to-be-seen threat, something that's waiting up ahead, something that these monsters are afraid of. The same thing with trophies that they might find on anything that's living in here. If the warriors of one tribe, they all have these necklaces made out of some sort of hooked talons, or maybe they have these stone-looking drinking horns on their belts that have these mother-of-pearl interiors, they can give a good idea of what might be on the other side of that fortified passage. But we should also be foreshadowing just signs of life in general. The smells, the sounds of the monsters drumming in the deep. What sounds are they making? The stink of their refuse, or maybe what their refuse is. Well, it's no longer canonical before D&D piercers were changed into whatever the hell these goofy things are. Older editions had them as mollusks with hard stalactite shells that would drop down from a cave ceiling and impale you. Now, one gag that I used when I was using piercers is the player characters discover these glistening paths along the walls, kind of like snail trails. Maybe they'd find a sharp cone-like shell, looking like a hollow stalactite, but the inside was smooth and glistened like mother of pearl. Then they'd look up and see that all the stalactites are kind of moving along the ceiling, positioning above them. So they had a little bit of foreshadowing before these things started raining down on them. Remember that the bad guys move. When you're drawing your dungeon out, you might have these 3 ogres in here in this particular room, but eventually they're going to move. So if the player characters are taking too long for it to move themselves, or making a lot of noise, they might have an encounter as a result. Those 3 ogres, that's merely what their starting position was when the PCs entered the dungeon or they got close to them, but they shouldn't just be sitting there forever, indefinitely waiting for the player characters to come walking in as if they didn't hear the player characters battling all the other monsters outside that door. Now, eventually they're just gonna move in general. They got ogre things to do and ogre things to see. They've got lives to live. The dungeon itself should feel like a living place, and the things inside of it are going to be moving around. They're going to be reacting to the sounds of battle, but they're also just going to leave signs of their presence, different smells, sounds, bits of trash, and the more little details like that you sprinkle in, the more that it's going to feel like a real place to your players. Some rooms are going to be populated, while other rooms are going to be empty, and having an encounter in every single room, that gets predictable and monotonous after a while. So, but if they find an entry room that the bad guys are at least aware of, not some long forgotten passage that the residents don't even know about anymore, but, some empty room that the bad guys do use from time to time, like a storage room. So the player characters, they hide in the storage room as a good place to heal or rest, but if this dungeon is a living place with an active community inside of it, eventually that ogre is going to stroll into that storage room looking for something, like a cup of flour, or maybe they're searching for those pesky heroes that killed their friends and nobody's been able to find them. We should also consider the social and political ecology of this place. Maybe if we're in a sufficiently large enough dungeon, we have different factions or tribes living here, such as in Conan's Red Nails. Conan finds this giant enclosed city where there's 2 warring tribes of people, and he has to line himself and work his way between them, socially, trying to figure out and navigate this the best. So the player characters, they might be able to disrupt the peace or the trade that's going on between these different nations, or pitting them up against each other, maybe help creating a peace between them, or if nothing else, there's going to be markers or signs as the player characters are traveling from one territory to another, something to let people know that, hey, you're in our territory now. Populated dungeons are also where we can have social encounters. A popular design theory is the 3 pillars of gaming, and social being one of those 3 pillars. Now, not every adventure is going to be able to have social encounters. I disagree with the idea that every single adventure just has to have them. With dungeons, depending on the situation, social encounters might be limited, if even possible at all. It's very, very situational. But possibilities could be that, they're going to have social encounters with the dungeon residents. Maybe the creatures here can be talked to, like I mentioned in Conan's Red Nails earlier, or, maybe they can sway a faction onto the hero's side, or at least some members of those factions, such as you encounter that one lone goblin who might be on the outs from the rest of their clan, but, they were curious and they went to investigate the player characters, and the player characters might be able to befriend it and find out what it knows. Or maybe inside the dungeon we can find prisoners, maybe enslaved, and they're working in the kitchens or working in the mines, or maybe people who have been trapped inside a magic mirror and the player characters can rescue them. That could be a really good source of backup characters in case any of the PCs gets incapacitated or killed. Or maybe we can encounter an entire different group of adventurers who are here looking for the same thing that the player characters are. Maybe they're looking for something completely different. Maybe this could lead to a future quest as they team up together. Or maybe they they go into competition against each other. Now, while social encounters are not impossible to do in dungeons, they might be difficult to work in. Again, it completely depends on whatever your situation is. Now let's switch gears and talk about the dungeon's layout. What does this dungeon look like? How are we going to map this place? First thing that I like to consider is its history. Why is this dungeon here? What is its function? And not just what is its function, but what was its function? You should always embrace whatever the history of the dungeon is. Maybe it was an old tomb, and then some monsters moved in here, and they started living in the crypts and the alcoves, and they started digging new tunnels and sealing off passages and just making this place their own. But at the same time, those features of it previously being a tomb should still exist here. Maybe coffin lids are now being used as the different doors around this place, or maybe the giant bronze doors to the mausoleum are now being used as a bridge to go over some sort of gap. If this was some sort of old dwarven mine that then became a dwarven city that was then abandoned and then taken over by goblins, you should show evidence of each phase in the layout and the features of this place. Maybe even relics from its previous incarnations have been repurposed here. An old mine might have sections of tracks and carts and lift shafts and old broken rock crushers that are rotting somewhere. I once had it when we were going through an abandoned mine and some goblins had moved in there. They had taken it over and they had taken sections of the metal tracks for the carts and they had fashioned them into a bow for a ballista. When I ran the Curse of Blackteeth Keats for Pulp Cthulhu, there was a Goonies-style pirate ship that was trapped inside a cave. Now, they didn't provide a map for it, so I made this one. And one trap was a bunch of iron cannonballs that could come pouring down on top of you if you hit this trap. Now, the module description originally had those traps described that it'd be rocks that fall on you instead of cannonballs, but I thought cannonballs worked a lot better because the pirates would have them at their disposal, and while the players, all the adventures they've gone through, they're kind of used to the idea of rocks pouring on down them from above. But you've never had cannonballs pour on them from above, so the history of this place should reflect what it is now, what it is that the people that were constructing this place or constructing its traps, what it is they had at their disposal should all be worked into this. You might even put traces of former heroes in there, notes that have been scratched into walls or even bodies. In the old AD&D adventure, The Lost Caverns of Sojkinth, there was a dead elf adventure that the player characters might find, and I always really liked this as a nice foreshadowing of an immediate threat that they're about to face. Now, these unfortunate dead adventurers, that might be a great way for the PCs to discover maps and items or just foreshadow some danger coming up, kind of like Chester Copperpot in the Goonies. If the dungeon is old, we might show signs of decay in this place. Maybe some of the traps, they no longer work the way that they were meant to. Maybe a scythe blade that's supposed to swing down from the ceiling, it gets jammed and, suddenly caught up, and then half the ceiling comes coming down with it, and the ceiling collapses on the player characters. Passages might have been sealed off by cave-ins, forcing the player characters to find a different way around. You have to go the long way around because the direct path has been sealed off. Maybe even the structural integrity of the walls and the roof have weakened, and loud noises could bring the threat of a cave-in, so they don't want to fire any fireballs or anything in here because the whole place will come down on them. Maybe giant tree roots have filled one portion of this dungeon, making it difficult to see or pass through this, but those roots are also the only thing that's still holding up the walls and the ceiling, so the player characters, they can't really chop these things up, or they have to be very careful if they're going to be cutting their way through this. Maybe the doors have succumbed to dry rot or swollen with moisture. It might be easier or harder to open because of that. Maybe the locks and the hinges and the other things have fused with rust, making them impossible to operate anymore. Lower levels might have been flooded with rain or seeping groundwater, so now the player characters have to wade through these portions, cold, brackish water. Now they're contending with things like sunken debris, different obstacles that might be hiding under the surface, or they're wading through portions and they don't see the fact that there's an open pit in front of them, so now they fall and sink down in this flooded pit. Their movement's going to be hampered and their attempts to go invisible or spoiled because everyone can clearly see these, the hole that they're making in the water with their legs. Speaking of water, if the dungeon is populated or was intended to have a population, consider the habitation requirements of this place. Where does the smoke and the sewage go? How does the smoke escape this place and not fill it up? How does fresh oxygen get down to the lower levels? Ventilation isn't something that I've seen addressed in most published dungeons, but it's a little consideration here can open up a lot of cool possibilities for you. we? So maybe something is pumping oxygen down to the lower levels, like they do for mines. Maybe huge fans are being operated by workers or teams of animals, or magical constructs are operating these pumps. If it's operated by workers or animals, where are those workers and animals housed? They have a special housing unit for them. If there's maybe a bunch of windmills that are up on the surface that are pumping the air, maybe we could have ventilation shafts, and that could mean alternate entrances and exits that the player characters could use. Maybe the ventilation isn't performed by pumps or fans, but is a furnace using rising hot air to suck fresh air inside. How much smoke is it producing if they do this? Maybe the nearby village knows that orcs have moved into the old abandoned mines because they can see all the smoke that's been billowing from these old vents that haven't had smoke coming from them in years. Or perhaps the ventilation is done through something like Arabian wind catchers, shafts leading straight down to the lowest levels that bring in fresh air. Now, what do these look like up on the surface? Are they distinct and ornate, or are they camouflaged so nobody knows that they're there? And I think Castle Ravenloft was the first dungeon I ever saw that incorporated ventilation shafts into the design. If the dungeon was designed to be populated, maybe install transom vents above the doors to the rooms so they can let fresh smoke out and fresh air in. Now those vents, now they're a cool way to spy or listen in on what's going on the other side of them. Or, maybe somebody could be able to just squeeze through that and open the door from the other side. Maybe lookouts are going to be up on ladders, posted there, looking out to see our heroes coming towards them and kind of warn their friends. Or ventilation might be provided by some secondary entrance to this dungeon, like an underground river that's far below it, and this creates a natural airflow and keeps the air moving. Clever player characters might use this to help navigate through this dungeon, watching out for different drafts that could lead them towards an exit. These little details, whether you're wanting to use foul air rules or not, that's completely up to you, they can really add to the realism and the architecture of this place, because this starts becoming something that you begin thinking about when you're designing your dungeons. Lighting is another consideration. Even creatures with low light vision might like to have a little bit of illumination in their home. Are we going to be using torches or oil lamps? Maybe natural gas lines if they're advanced enough to harness natural gas. Remember ventilation here, but also where are all these spare torches or jugs of oil being stored? If you think about where your oil storage is, or where you're housing all your mules that operate your ventilation pumps, that starts giving you purpose rooms that you can add to your map. If this room is specifically for this purpose. If your society has the magic to do it, maybe their lighting is provided by glowing gems that have been set into the walls or the ceiling. Maybe we can have mirrors that catch the sunlight and direct it below, or something like deck prisms or Seattle sidewalk glass that set into the roof or floors, allowing light to pass through. Maybe the inhabitants grow bioluminescent fungus on the walls. Maybe it's wild fungus growing wherever it can in a haphazard array, or maybe it's in little artistically cultivated gardens that are set at a certain specific height and watered through some elaborate drip system and fed by natural springs. Maybe it's lit by glowworms that are wild and feeding on insects or guano, or possibly some domesticated variety that's been specifically bred and fed for this purpose. Something that's unique to this dungeon, or maybe something that they traded from another culture from the Underdark. The means of how a society illuminates their underground layers tells us a lot about that society and what their technology or their magic level is. Water might come from underground rivers or sunken wells or springs. It might come from aqueducts and gathered rainwater and stored in enormous cisterns. The cisterns of Masada, which was atop a butte in the middle of the desert beside the Dead Sea, its cisterns had held 10 million gallons of water. That's a whole dungeon right there. Food might be brought in and stored or grown in subterranean gardens beneath artificial lights, or mushroom crops in dark and moistened caves. This isn't a consideration that you don't need if it's going to be a non-living dungeon like a tomb or something like that. But if this dungeon was built to support a population or allow a castle to survive a long siege, then those storage places still exist and those gardens still exist. And what might the player characters be able to find there now? Okay, so now that I've given you all of these random things to consider, let's get to the architecture, actually building this thing. The design and the room layout of the dungeon itself can be done several different ways. Some people like to do it random. Either you throw a bunch of dice onto a grid and you draw a room around each one of those dice where it fell, and the size of the room depends on what number came up on the dice. Or there's geomorph tiles where you can just draw cards from a deck and lay a map quickly out on the table. Personally, I find that cool for random maps, natural construction caves. However, for design dungeons, I don't really like those methods. The reason being is that the random method often yields results that don't really make much sense. Why are these rooms or passages even here? Well, it all feels random because that's how it was made. So with constructed dungeons, I like to draw them out. Again, using the dungeon's functional history. I want the whole thing to make sense. Now, this could be a linear dungeon where one room leads to another that leads to another, essentially a straight path, even if it's kind of circling around. But, you really need a good reason to make it a linear dungeon. I don't think you should do that unless it needs to be linear. The better option is multiple paths, giving the players choices of which passages and rooms they want to explore first. This also gives them the fear and the excitement of maybe they're going to make the wrong choice, rather than just kind of leading them through this place by the nose because they don't have any choice at all. Now we can take this simple map that I just threw together for this video and say that it might have a portion might have collapsed, in the passage between rooms 6 and 7, or maybe it was intentionally walled off as the dungeon's purpose changed, sealing off a section that's now been forgotten or never been known about by the current occupants. Maybe we can then add a small fissure, and maybe it was dug out by some resident or animal or naturally opened up just because the earth's shifting, but that requires a small character to get through it, or maybe the full-size player characters can get through it, but only very slowly and one at a time as they're trying to navigate this little gap. Or maybe we could just have this fissure here without the rubble, allowing the player characters to bypass or sneak behind some threat that's up ahead. The point is that we want to give the players options because we want to lead them in an engaging adventure where they've got choices and they can decide what their own fate is. For example, in Death Station, the dungeon is a ring ship, so the whole thing is a loop. So once the player characters get inside from one of the entrances, they can go either direction they want to reach all the locations in the dungeon. In addition to multiple paths to go through the dungeon, you might consider multiple entrances and exits to the dungeon. Now, this doesn't work for all dungeons. I disagree with the notion that all dungeons must have multiple entrances, so you don't need to have multiple entrances if it's not appropriate for the dungeon, but it is something that's definitely worth considering. It's more considering why it shouldn't have multiple entrances. Now, these can be regular passages or burrowed tunnels, or maybe one of those ventilation shafts that we had covered earlier, or maybe an underground river. Now, if this place was a tomb where workers were to have been buried inside once the tomb was completed, maybe those workers, they built an escape tunnel somewhere, widened out one of the ventilation shafts or built a tunnel, just for the purpose of escape. And the player characters, they might be able to find that and use that to escape the dungeon themselves, or maybe get access to the dungeon. Or you could do it like the Hobbit did, where before going to the dragon's lair, the player characters acquired a key that allowed them to open up a back door to come in through the back entrance. Or you can make it where they enter this dungeon only knowing of one entrance, but once inside the dungeon, they set off a trap or some event happens that causes that entrance to seal or collapse shut behind them. And now the player characters, in addition to finding whatever item or whatever it was that they came into this dungeon to get, they're also going to have to find an escape to get out of here. Room shape is also important. A dungeon that's simply right angles is kind of boring, so vary this up. Have rooms that are tapered, round, hexagonal, star-shaped. Back in college, my players used to give me a lot of grief because I was overusing octagonal rooms because octagons are really easy to do on graph paper. Just simply cut the corners off a square and there you go. Since then, I started sketching out all of my dungeon maps on unlined paper. That way the grid doesn't influence the shape of the dungeon or the design of the dungeon. And then once I got that outline done, I'll then convert that over to graph paper and draw it out nice and proper and neat. You could also simply take a boring shape like this one and remove all the straight lines, warping it into something interesting. Even a subtle change like this makes it stand out to your players as being something interesting and memorable. Even things like lining your passages with alcoves creates a texture, not only cutting down on all those boring straight lines, but adds aspects to your players wondering what might be hiding in those different alcoves. It gives them that little sense of paranoia. I believe that every dungeon should have several completely unique features that set it apart from all the others, make it memorable. And one of the easiest ways of doing that, kind of the low-hanging fruit in doing that, is just with varying up your shape of your rooms. Next, when mapping it out, think three-dimensionally. Even a one-page dungeon can have various levels to it, stairs leading up or down, passages bypassing rooms, balconies looking down on other rooms. If you're making a large map that's going to be multiple pages, simply note where all the stairs and the shafts are that lead from one floor to another, even if they're bypassing that floor altogether. But for a little bit of added realism, have major walls line up between the levels, like structural supports for one another. So even if the floor plans between the different levels, one on top of the other, another, maybe have those key columns or those key walls line up to give the illusion that this place is structurally sound. And the illusion is really the key to this. I have zero doubt the structural integrity of any of my maps that would horrify a real architect, but putting that effort in to make it look like it appears as if it's structurally sound, that sells the illusion and therefore the immersion to your players that this dungeon is a real place. It was designed by real engineers. For that reason, also add columns to your large chambers. Aside from the fact that they make great in-game obstacles and cover, those columns or those braces that are ribbing the walls push the realism and they add to the physical texture of this place. Things like fireplaces tend to be at the same spot on every floor because they might use the same chimney shaft. Same thing with water. That's why rooms that have water access are frequently adjoining the same common wall floor to floor. These are things that most of us know, but we don't really think about that much, but we notice when we're looking at a map that doesn't follow those normal architecture rules. So always consider what is above or below a given floor at any dungeon level. So many years ago, a buddy of mine, he was running me through a dungeon that he had made, and the floors, it didn't make sense between them at all. Stairs, one of them was going from the first floor directly up to the third level and bypassing the second, perfectly fine, but on the second floor, there wasn't even a physical space where that stairwell would have been. Like it was just a big open room, but up on the third floor, it just opened up to some stairs, or there was a pit trap on one floor that was so deep it should have just dumped you onto the floor beneath it, but it didn't. So the spacing of this whole place was wrong and it was a mess simply because he wasn't thinking three-dimensionally when he designed the place. Now, while this is going to skim along some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in my next video over traps, one of the things I do want to mention is choke points. And what I mean here are places where the characters might hit a total roadblock if they fail to make a specific roll, and now the game is completely stalled out on you. An example of this is secret doors. I love secret doors. They're great. Scooby-Doo gave me a really unrealistic expectation of how many secret doors I was going to find in my everyday life. And while you might install secret doors in your dungeon, be very careful that you don't accidentally make a choke point because all of the characters failed to make their search roll against it, and that was the only way to get to the other half of the dungeon, and now the whole game is ground to a halt and everyone's frustrated because they don't know what to do or where to go next. The most evil one of these that I ever encountered was an old first edition AD&D module where half the dungeon could only be accessed by finding one particular secret door, but that door was hidden on the inside of a pit trap, so you had to go down inside the pit trap, search the walls, make your roll to find secret doors, and then and only then could you complete the second half of the dungeon. Devious? Yes. Brilliant? Yeah, pretty brilliant. Fun? It depends if your players made the roll or not. So my suggestion here is with things like that, either A, provide an alternate path to get to the rest of the dungeon. It might be a dangerous and longer way around, but it still means that the player characters can get access to the other half of the dungeon, but the secret door, finding that was simply a shortcut to do it. Such as with this little dungeon here. If we have a secret door here in room 2, but our characters, they're completely unable to find it, it prevents them from reaching or even knowing about the rest of the dungeon. However, room 6, we have a balcony, and the player characters, they can see it plainly there. It tells them that there's more to this dungeon. However, they're going to need to fly or teleport or climb their way up to that balcony, in addition to any monsters or anything that they might have to encounter just coming this way, but that balcony serves as an alternate means of reaching the rest of the dungeon. Or option B, we could have it where the discovery of the door or the passage itself isn't that difficult to do. It might just be plainly there in front of them, solid metal door without any seams at all. Or maybe it was supposed to be secret at one time, but the oil of all the hands has opened it. It's kind of left a really stained edge, and they can clearly see that there's a secret door there. So the problem is not finding the secret door, it's pretty easy to do. It's actually discovering the lever or the passcode or whatever special item it is to open that door. So they're going to have to figure that part out for themselves, but the fact that there was a door there, that wasn't a secret at all. Opening it is the secret. Now, of course, any solution to opening up a door, that should be something that the player characters knew to bring with them, so the Dungeon Master was guaranteed that they were going to have that on them, or it's something that they can discover on their side of the door. Much like in the movie The Goonies, there's a locked passage, and that could have stopped their adventure then and there. But fortunately, there was a key to opening up that passage, and it could be discovered somewhere else in the dungeon. So instead of the door's existence be the obstacle that the player characters have to face, and they miss the door and they don't know about that they missed the door, so now they're getting frustrated. Have the way of opening the door be the obstacle that they face. Also consider real architecture. Pay attention to how buildings are laid out, not just historic buildings, but schools, office buildings, houses, shopping malls. I've incorporated many real-world buildings into my dungeons, and it's not just a good source of inspiration, but gives a sense of realism because your layouts now include some of those really small details that you might not have thought about on your own. If you're going for some historic analog like ancient Egyptian, look at ancient Egyptian architecture. Incorporate ramps alongside or in place of stairs at places. Include aspects like false tombs or fool's treasuries inside your tombs to thwart grave robbers. The heroes, they brave the dungeon, they thwart its traps, only to discover a false tomb, meaning that they passed the real tomb entrance somewhere behind them, and all of this was just meant to thwart them. Change small things up, like the shape of the pillars. They might be round, square, offset square, diamond shaped, maybe hexagonal, or just different shapes altogether. Maybe these shapes make them easier or harder to climb. When making your dungeon or your dwellings, consider what rooms that you need for this. Make a checklist of them. Kitchen, food stores, armory, bedroom, barracks, common areas and dining, workshops, dungeon cells, torture chambers, large temples, small altar rooms, pens and stables for the animals, library, latrines. Figure out which rooms your building needs, and then when you're making your dungeon, you can create and assign rooms for each of those functions in appropriate places. That way your kitchens are somewhere near your dining rooms. Remember windows. I am forever amazed at how many RPG maps I see of dwellings where the bedrooms and the kitchens are all placed in the middle with no access to windows at all. Many modern building codes require the bedrooms have access to windows for ventilation or emergency egress. And while your buildings might be in a historical fantasy realm or in the distant future and they don't have the same building codes at all or even any building codes at all, that is still something to consider is, how are we getting the natural light and ventilation? And easiest way of doing that's with windows. Now, aside from the dungeon's layout, which is something you can easily see in your two-dimensional map that you made, also think about the dungeon's aesthetics. Those stone walls, are they rough-hewn, smooth blocks, cyclopean masonry? Are they covered and smoothed with plaster, maybe painted with elaborate frescoes or hieroglyphs? What if the walls are lined with the bones of the dead? Does this change any modifiers if you're trying to search the walls for traps or trying to climb them? If the player characters are exploring a tomb, this is a monument to whoever is buried here, right? So maybe sprinkle it with trophies from their former life, statues depicting the great moments of their loved ones. Engrave or paint the walls in the history of this person. What great deeds did they do that warranted them having this huge tomb in the first place? Maybe those will hold some sort of clue that the player characters need, how to open up the crypt or warnings of some great threat that's now lurking somewhere else inside this dungeon. Here is a guardian, or simply to add flavor or to add information about the world that your game is set in. The map might show where the pillars are, they might show that they're round, but are they smooth? Are they fluted, spiral? Are they organic looking and carved like vine-covered tree trunks? Or maybe they could just be statues. Maybe the shape of these round pillars makes them easier or harder to climb. Are they any particular color? Does that mean anything that they're any particular color? If the ceilings are flat, sharply peaked, coffered, or vaulted arches. With doors, what shapes are the doors? Most of us naturally assume that our doors are probably just rectangular shape, but what if they're arched or perfectly round? Are they hinged or do they slide or pivot in some way? And also think of fantasy aesthetics. The old dwarves are Art Deco, while elves are Art Nouveau meme that I've seen around there. Incorporate those stylings when you're describing the carvings and the door hinges or the metal or stone grates that are covering up all the vents. Back in the old days of infravision, back when non-human creatures, they saw through heat signatures, we would have these dwarven mosaics inside their cities that were made out of different materials, not based off what color those materials were, but how those materials conducted heat, or maybe they gave off a little bit of radiation. So a human looking at them, they just see this chaotic mess of colors that wouldn't make any sense to them at all. Well, dwarves and elves, they saw as this beautiful artistic scenes or designs. All of these little architectural styles and aesthetic choices that you're making, everything that you do that paints a picture in your players' minds of something unique or outside the assumed normal, those cement these places into your players' minds. It makes it memorable, and they can say how much better your dungeons are than all the other ones that they've seen when all you really did was describe the details that most people forget to add or describe. Now, for research or inspiration, there are countless sources out there. We got the freaking internet, but there's There's movies, video games, and just different things that you can encounter in your everyday life. But one thing that really made a big impression on me when I was 13 and getting into D&D and Tolkien was Winslow and Walsh's Kingdom of the Dwarves, which really went into dwarven society, what their underground cities were like, what their everyday lives were like, and how they got their food and their water, how they set up their defenses from attackers, or how their royal palaces look. It's probably because of that book that I've frequently made dungeons out of abandoned dwarven cities or featured active dwarven cities in my various games over the years, so I highly recommend looking into various resources about the everyday life or infrastructure of whatever type of people it is that inhabit your game world, because you might pick up a lot of cool little details that you can add to your game and make it feel a little bit more interesting or real, just lots of little things you wouldn't have thought of before. Another book that I found very useful when I was young and getting started, so it might be worth looking into, maybe not, is the old AD&D 2nd edition Catacomb Guide, and it had some really cool advice on making dungeons and several cool maps of various dungeons and abandoned buildings, giving the layouts for them, and I found it really useful back in the days before the internet. Okay, well that is it for part 1. This ended up being a far longer video than I had planned, but I kept coming up with more and more stuff that I wanted to add to it. Even then, there's probably 100 details that I missed or just didn't have room to squeeze in here. I probably should have made this a 3-part series instead of a 2-part series, and hopefully the chapter timestamps will help anyone kind of come back and review portions if they want to see something again, or maybe have to break it up over several viewings because this video is long. Now, I'm already working on the next video. Most of that script is already finished and written out, so I'd already actually written out a lot of it before I realized that it was so long I had to split it up into 2 and it had grown so long, so hopefully it won't be too terribly long before I release that video. And that one's going to cover traps, obstacles, threats, rewards, as well as various objectives and various plots as to why the characters are going to go inside this dungeon, or ways to lay out key plot nodes and quest points. That way they can kind of be assured that they have to visit the various parts of the dungeon. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of my stuff, like game reviews or just the second part of the series, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, gamers, have a great day. Whew.